Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. I'm Jack Rasmussen. I'm the head of the Department of Plant Pathology. I'd like to start out by thanking Mitch and Eric, President Samuelson, for the opportunity to do this. Some new faces for us. That would lead me to say thanks and congratulations to Tim on his retirement. Plant pathology has a long and I think very productive for both parties relationship with Northarvest. I started in the 1990s working with some research projects with Northarvest. Ken Grafton, the breeder at the time, kind of got me started in that. And now the role I have, the interaction I have with the group is different, but I really enjoy it. So really on behalf of all of NDSU, not just plant pathology, but breeding, soils, agronomy, thanks. So we've got some new faces and we've got some old faces. One of the new faces is in the back in the corner, I think. Malaika Eber, why don't you stand up and wave to the group? Malaika is a new plant pathologist that joined the department in September. She'll be working, she'll have responsibility for diseases of dry beans and yellow pulses. And she started in September, so she's brand new. And in the future, maybe we'll see Malaika up here. I don't know, maybe we'll have to try to make that work, Mitch, right? Yeah, Malaika is a native of Germany, and she's profiled on page 25 of the Winter Bean Grower magazine, if you want to check that out. Some of the more experienced panel members, faculty members, are with me up here. I'll introduce them. We've got some expertise in really all aspects of plant protection, including weed science, entomology, and plant pathology. Plant pathology kind of dominates it, but that's okay, right? Joe Ikley, extension weed scientist. He comes to us by way of Purdue University. He's been on faculty for, 3-4 years, I think. Janet Knodel is our extension entomologist. Jan's been in NDSU for several years, including a stint at the Minot Research Extension Center, and now she's on campus as the extension entomologist. And part of her responsibilities are putting together the dry bean grower survey. So when you participate in that, Jan and her group, primarily Pat, who's also back there, are responsible for taking care of that. Sam Markell is our extension plant pathologist, responsibilities for broadleaf crops, which of course includes dry bean. Sam's been with us for several years and obviously is very excellent. I think probably many of you know him. Michael Wunsch, plant pathologist from Carrington Research and Extension Center. Michael has a well-deserved reputation, I think, as a world authority on white mold. It was interesting during the noontime comments that part of the early days of this group were based on white mold, and here we are. We're still working on white mold. Maybe we'll solve that once and for all, but in the meantime, we're making progress, and Michael's very critical to that. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different format. I've put together some questions. Not so much round robin, maybe at the end, but because we're dominated by plant pathologists, I'm going to show I'm not biased. I'm going to start with Joe, if that's okay. Joe, what's the latest in the world of weeds? Producers are all worried about weeds. Do you have any specific concerns for the dry bean growers this year?
Weeds and dry beans? Yeah, so some specific concerns of mine going into 2022. The top one on my mind and statewide for North Dakota would be kochia, and even kind of creeping more into Minnesota than maybe we've dealt with the past couple years, just because of the dry conditions. So a lot of kochia went to seed last year, so we know it's a pretty good chance kochia is going to be basically number one on our minds going into this year. And so luckily we still have some tools for kochia control and dry bean. Another weed that's top of my mind, more so for the Minnesota folks, but it's slowly approaching the North Dakota acres, would be water hemp. So the dry conditions last year really, we didn't have water hemp as problematic on North Dakota side of the river, but it's been more and more problematic for Minnesota, and we're running out of herbicide options for control of that one as well. So that's also kind of top of mind. And another one that just questions keep increasing would be common ragweed. And the main thing there is because where we have resistance to products like permit and then reflex, we just actually don't have the chemical options to control any ragweed escapes in dry beans. And so that's one, just because of lack of chemistry, that we can take care of in rotational crops quite well, but as far as dry bean crop themselves, becoming more and more problematic.
So you kind of alluded to this, but I wondered, as somebody who doesn't really deal with weeds, the difference between Minnesota and North Dakota, if there is any, even from the point of view of regulations or anything. Is there anything people need to worry about there?
We don't have enough time to touch regulations.
Yeah, okay.
But just weed species-wise, I just go back to looking at kochia versus water hemp. So just more dry, more arid on the North Dakota side, kochia thrives a little bit better. As we get into higher rainfall, higher humidity environments, further south and east we go, water hemp is really thriving in those conditions. There are some product differences as far as what 24Cs we have available for things like Spartan Elite and those types of products. So I know the North Dakota side better than Minnesota for those regulations, but there are some slight differences. But if I'm picking on one or a couple weeds, kochia, water hemp, that's kind of the divide that I look at.
Okay, thanks. Michael, what have you been working on lately? Perhaps more specifically, is there anything new with regards to spray technology, fungicide timing, nozzles, anything like that you want to share with the group?
All right. Those of you who have followed the work we've been doing on white mold, we've been doing our work on white mold in conjunction with our soybean work. Okay, so basically what we're working on in soybeans, we also work on dry beans. And what I have found is that really the two are complementary. And a lot of what we're learning on soybeans, we're finding to be true on dry beans too. The big challenge that we have is how do we get our fungicides to work a little bit better? Everyone knows that the fungicides provide only partial control. Okay, we are now done with a third year of fungicide timing studies. And I'll have a nice write-up of that in your research issue of the Northarvest Bean Growers magazine, okay? And what we're finding with that is very parallel to what we saw in soybeans, okay? And what we're learning is that we need to be focusing on, rather than percent of plants with an open blossom, what we really need to be looking at is the percent of plants with the initial pin pods. All right, so once the blossom senesces, it immediately produces, you immediately get this little initial pin pod with a senesced blossom, okay? And you need to look at canopy closure. All right, and if that canopy is at or near closure, so 90 to 100% of the ground covered with a canopy across your field on average, okay, it looks like the appropriate timing is about 10 to 15% of plants with those initial pin pods. The reason why I'm focusing on that is that in my experience, some years we have very, very consistent bloom across all of our dry beans. And some years it's not quite as consistent. Okay, and so some years you hit your 10 to 15% of plants with a pin pod when 80% of your plants have an open blossom. Other years, it's 55% of plants with an open blossom, okay? All right, but it's the pin pods that matter because that's the senesced blossom through which the white mold enters. Now, if your canopy is open, you can actually delay, and you're better off delaying. until about 50 to 75% of your plants have pin pods. And this is the exact same thing that we saw on soybeans. All right, so you really have to pay attention to both your senescent blossoms, i.e. your pin pods, your initial pin pods, and canopy closure. All right, as far as droplet size is going, that work is ongoing, but what we are learning is that you need to calibrate your droplet size relative to canopy closure. Okay, and you can get a really good return on investment by doing that. And so the more closed the canopy is, the coarser your droplet. Okay, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Michael. From my perspective, your work's really incredible. I think it changes the paradigm, how we think about white mold. I like that. Jan, last summer obviously was hot and dry. My sense, as a biologist, I guess, is that the environment favors insect populations, at least for some species, grasshoppers and so forth. What should producers be watching for this year on the insect front?
Well, yes, last year we did have a lot of grasshoppers, especially in North Dakota. And then also when it's dry, spider mites can become an issue later, usually in the season. And then also potato leafhopper. They migrate up into the area. They don't overwinter here in North Dakota or Minnesota. So that's one that we have to scout for regularly to see if you're going to have potato leafhopper out there in the field. So I'm thinking we're supposed to kind of be dry again is what I heard for a forecast. That might change. And we've gotten some adequate moisture now with all the snowfall. So I think for the spring, we're off to a good start. And when it's real wet in the spring, you need to watch for seed corn maggot. And with Lora's band going away, we won't have that for this upcoming season. And that was Lora's band was a key for control of seed corn maggot in furrow or as a seed treatment. So now there is alternatives we can use insecticide seed treatment in the neonicotinoid family, or you could use in-furrow pyrethroid for control of the seed corn maggot. So I think we'll have to wait and see what the weather brings, but certainly, get out and scout regularly. That's kind of the key for insects. They move around a lot. So, scouting is number one in finding them early before they cause any economic damage to the plant.
Okay, thanks. Sam, Michael set the stage here for this question a little bit. He didn't know I was going to ask this, but Sam keeps a watchful eye for new and emerging diseases. That's part of his job. We have several such new diseases in soybean, frog eyes, sudden death syndrome, and things like that. Sam, is there anything on the horizon for dry bean that would be new that we need to worry about? And do any of these new soybean pathogens present any worry for production?
Well, I guess I hope not. So you hit on that. I do think that one of the most important things that I do, and maybe all of us do, is keep an eye on the horizon and see what's happening. And we all work on multiple crops. The sudden death syndrome in soybean is interesting. It was not necessarily a surprise, but we found that in Richland County on soybeans in 2018, and then it jumped up to Cavalier in 2020, and that's a 250 mile jump. And part of the reason is it's a soil-borne pathogen, and it can move on anything that moves soil, equipment, water, whatever that is. So, but to the dry bean question about sudden death, that pathogen can cause a disease on dry beans. It's kind of a root rot, but it does not do the sudden death thing. The sudden death thing on soybeans is that you get a root infection and there's a plant toxin that goes and kills the plant. And we don't see that happen in dry beans. So if you get it in dry beans, it's just, you might have a little bit of root rot, but that's about it. The frog eye leaf spot thing on soybeans, that's a pathogen that in theory could survive on dry beans. I wouldn't expect any real problem with it. And it likes it hot and wet. And I don't know, we don't have a lot of years that are hot and wet. And so this has caused problems in the I states in the Mid-South. And so I don't see that being too much of a problem, maybe on soybeans either. So I'm hopeful those two things are not going to be too big of an issue, and especially on dry beans, I don't see too much of an issue. I'd say the other thing that we see is on the horizon. What we do, as much as we can, we try to keep track of the pathogens we have, and if there's changes, like a new rust race, for example. And we saw some of that. Juan would tell you that a decade ago we saw a big shift in the rust pathogen, and as new resistant varieties are released, we need to keep an eye on the pathogen to make sure they're not overcoming the genes. The last thing that probably is new-ish is soybean cyst nematode. We see that a lot in the southern part of the valley in particular. It's moving north, it's moving east in Minnesota, it's moving west in North Dakota, and that can cause some problems on dry beans. So keeping an eye on that is important.
All right, thank you. I have to confess, we were cornered earlier in during the meeting here and asked about soybean cyst nematode. So I think it is a concern, at least for some. Jan, you mentioned Lord's ban. So what's new with regulations? What's going on with insecticides?
Well, the EPA has revoked all tolerance for crop production, pesticide production, and anything to deal with food that we eat. And so Lorsban is no longer available for use. And fortunately, we do have some alternatives that are also efficacious, especially against some of the soil insect pests, where it was primarily used as a soil insecticide. So we should be okay in the dry beans, even though we won't have Lorsban this next year. It was kind of unprecedented that it was revoked this way, and it's the first time I can recall that insecticide has been lost in this certain procedure that went on. So anyway, hopefully, we will be okay, I think, with all the above ground insect pests. We have quite a few different pyrethroids registered. There's a few organophosphates like dimethoate that you can use for spider mite control. If you do see spider mites, remember the only pyrethroid you can use is the active ingredient bifenthrin. All the other ones will flare spider mites and actually increase the population and cause a worse problem. So you need to be careful on that. And we do have some miticides in dried bean. We have the avamectin and Zeal, I believe it is. But be sure you look at the insect guide. There's all the insecticides that are registered in dry bean and other crops are all listed in there.
Okay, thanks. Michael, I obviously hear from earlier comments, think of you as a white mold expert, but I know you have lots of other projects. Have you been working on anything else that might be of interest to this group? Any other diseases?
Well, I work on 9 to 11 crops every year, and I tell you, on dry beans, yeah, we do some other work on dry beans, but really white mold is the bulk of what we do on dry beans. The white mold work is a tremendous effort because the disease is so spotty. So you can have hot spots and cold spots and short distances. And so to do the type of work that we're doing, you have to run lots of reps. A lot of our studies are done with 10, 12 replicates, okay, when you're looking at timing or droplet size. So not really, no. I mean, yeah, we do some screenings for companies to test fungicide efficacy. Yeah, I mean, on the dry bean work for white mold, I will let you know we have been looking at optimizing row spacing and seeding rate for maximizing yield potential. And in the kidneys, we've seen a real advantage to being in 15-inch rows for yield potential. Okay, at least those are light red kidneys. Okay, and irrespective of white mold pressure on the pintos, those 15-inch rows are optimizing yield as long as you're below about 20% of the canopy diseased. After that, it's a wash. Of course, wide rows always minimize your disease, but obviously we have to make money too, right? So we've been doing some work on spray volume, And the crazy thing is that we're seeing no response to increasing spray volume on fungicides above 10 gallons an acre. I have to confirm that, but it actually confirms it's the same thing that some researchers out in Brazil found on soybeans. So we're still doing that work. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Joe, kind of a follow-up to something we talked about earlier. Let's see where I am here. We spoke earlier about fungicide application technologies and timing. Is there anything new going on at NDSU in with regards to that, with regards to herbicides?
Yeah, so as far as precision application technology, really nothing new for the dry bean world. When I look at the world of weed science, we're just currently dominated by trying to make the extend and enlist products in soybeans work, and all the number of different application parameters that those products require, which those are larger droplets, and what we're using in dry beans is high carrier volume and smaller droplets to get good coverage for things like Bazagran and reflex. So most of the just weed science work on precision application technology isn't, it's kind of a different realm than going on the dry beans. So, for this group, it's just not going to be a whole lot of overlap.
Okay. Sam, your group does a lot of field plot work with various commodities, including dry bean. What have you been working on the last few years, and what should producers be looking for in their fields with regards to diseases? What should they do if they see something?
Yeah, so the first part of that is, I would say we do quite a few different trials, fungicide, efficacy, seed treatment trials. Probably we do the least on white mold because Michael does so much of it. We do quite a few rust trials. So we've been evaluating products that are labeled, some that are not labeled, some of the newer blends, things like that, probably for the last decade. We do quite a few root rot trials. We have the luxury of being able to do some of this work on campus. We can do things that none of you would let us do on your farm, like grow rhizoc in the lab and plant it in the field and then plant the seed on top of it, right? Those are pretty toxic to the dry beans, but it does give us a good ability to screen some of these products. I would say at least half of what we do is the more novel chemistries that are not available yet. So when they do become available, we've got a little bit of data for you. But probably with dry beans, I'd say the bulk of the work we do is with rust and some of the root rots.
Okay. So I'm going to open this up to the whole group. Genetic resistance to pesticides is a growing problem, in agriculture with regards, doesn't matter if it's weeds, insects, or pathogens. Are there chemistries you are most worried about, and what should producers do to reduce the risk of developing pesticide resistance?
Sounds like a good weed question to me, Joe.
Well, to start, as far as new chemistry coming, I can't tell you anything new is coming in the next 5 years. For use in dry bean, maybe taking a look at some older products and trying to get some dry bean use out of them. So if you look at rotations in general, that really just is concerning we just haven't had a new herbicide mode of action for 30 years. And maybe in 5 years, we'll get one for corn, soybean, wheat market. That's kind of where the global focus is really for herbicides. But as far as, what we're using, resistance issues, as I mentioned with common ragweed, so we're kind of narrowed into post-emergence and dry beans. We're really reliant on Raptor, Reflex, and then Bazagran, and the resistance to Raptor and Reflex. So group 2 ALS inhibitors would be Raptor, and then our group 14 herbicides is a Reflex type chemistry. We have that in ragweed, stacked resistance. The southern edge of our territory for dry beans, we have that in water hemp. It's not really widespread yet. So basically, as those become more widespread or prevalent, it's just going to make control of those, especially post-emergence in dry beans, much more difficult, if not impossible. So the fact that we're not getting much new as far as herbicides, we're stuck with the ones we have. So using a rotation is really our best benefit for weeds like that to drive down populations a year or two ahead of planting dry beans. Then it's a little bit more manageable with the pre-emergence herbicides that we still have and that are still effective.
Yeah, for our insects, we're also seeing the development of insecticide resistance. You're probably familiar with soybean aphid, and here in the valley on both sides of the states, North Dakota and Minnesota, we've documented pyrethroid resistance. It's fairly common, and fortunately, for soybean aphid, we've been able to get 3 new modes of action that are fairly specific just to aphids and other parasite-sucking insects. So that's been fortunate, but some of them cost more than the pyrethroids. But we do recommend, rotation of the mode of action if you're going to spray more than once. Don't use the same mode repeatedly that same season. It's very important to rotate. And then also, if you're using the same mode of action year after year for the same pest, and it's a key pest that you see every year, rotate that mode of action. And then first and foremost, always know your pest. Make sure it's a pest first and not a beneficial. There's a lot of beneficials out there, and know the biology of that pest. And then make sure you get out there and scout frequently, and then use the economic thresholds, because they're established to so when you will get your money back for use of the cost and application of that insecticide. So use those thresholds so we spray when we don't, when you need to. And so the main thing though is rotate. Don't use the same pyrethroid repeatedly year after year. And then also in insect research, they found using a low rate of the insecticide, the insect is able to become resistant faster at a low rate than a high rate. So if you're dealing with an insect like an aphid, we do recommend that you use a higher labeled rate of that insecticide to try and prevent resistance. So, and we are seeing some problems with our crucifer flea beetles in canola, and also our red sunflower seed weevil in South Dakota right now with pyrethroids not working for the weevil, and with the neonicotinoid seed treatments for the different species of flea beetles. So it's happening out there, and sometimes it takes several years before we start to notice it.
I think on the pathology side, I don't know that I have a lot to add. Chemical rotation is really important. Genetic rotation is really important. I would maybe say that in dry beans, I don't know that I have a specific concern of a specific pathogen per se. I think in agriculture in general, and Michael might have something to add too, but in agriculture in general, at least with the crops we grow, the chemical that I'm most concerned about are the strobilurins, these FRAC 11 chemicals like headline, quadris, approach, that sort of thing. There's a lot of crops we grow in this area where a pathogen or two has blown through them. I mean, from if you grow sugar beets, about it, all the way to chickpeas in the western part of the state that probably none of you grow. Ascochyta has blown through the strobilurins. So that chemistry in particular is a bit of a concern. And maybe I would add, just to emphasize this, so we found frog eye leaf spot in soybeans the first time in 2020, right? And we were tipped off by a producer. And had we not got that call, we might not have noticed frog eye before the freeze. So because we did, we were able to get in that field, and then we did a survey in the southeastern part of the state, like a 36-hour blitzkrieg, and then it froze like maybe September 9th or something, like 2020. It turns out that 25% of all those isolates we took were already resistant to the strobilurins. This thing had blown up from South Dakota or Iowa or somewhere, and they had already seen this resistance show up, and then unfortunately we inherited. So I guess maybe a couple things just to emphasize. That chemistry, I'm really concerned in agriculture just in general, but also what you see in your field, if you see a chemical that's not performing, let somebody know, because we won't notice it in our research plots, right? I mean, we might, but you'll see it a lot sooner than we will. So that really, really helped. That producer that tipped us off was critical.
Yeah, it looks like we're about out of time, but I was going to say if there are any questions from the audience.
What hope do we have for edible beans against the soybean cyst nematode, either in varieties or in chemical or what have you?
I think the hope is pretty good in the long run. So Berlin Nelson, he's a soybean pathologist that just retired. He'd been working on SCN and dry beans, and he was funded by the Checkoff for years. One of the things that he did just recently, I think he's just writing this up for the magazine, is he screened a lot of different dry bean varieties in a bunch of different market classes. And he's found that not all market classes are created equal. Some of them are a little more sensitive to SCN than others, but in general, they're more resistant than a susceptible soybean. So it's not a looming train wreck. It's not like every bean is susceptible. They're really not. And because some of them are resistant in these different market classes, I think there's a pretty good chance we can breed for this. You know, in some of the market classes, blacks come to mind. Most of those varieties would be equivalent to a resistant or maybe a moderately resistant soybean. Does that answer your question? I think the outlook is pretty good. Oh, for chemicals too. You know, so the seed treatment nematicide world is still evolving in soybeans, and we will probably follow their lead. We're still pulling data together, and I think there's a home for those products. You know, soybean cyst is a nematode that goes through several life cycles over the course of a season, so the egg levels skyrocket. The seed treatments might knock that down in that first cycle, and that could be helpful. So I think the outlook is pretty good. I would emphasize to everyone in the room, though, if you probably should sample for SCN. I mean, you probably should sample for it, and if you got it, you got to manage it on your soybeans as best you can. Don't blow those egg levels up, because that'll hurt the edibles.
You know, I would congratulate Northarvest for some forward thinking several years ago. Tim, I was in the room, the grant panel, when you first heard the proposal from Berlin Nelson, wanting to look at how dry beans responded to soybean cyst nematode, and you guys funded it, and it turned out to be kind of a big deal. So.
And I should mention too, I see Juan over there. Juan Osorno, yeah, don't hide. Juan has started working with Berlin years ago, right? Trying to identify resistance, trying to move that into varieties. And that also goes back to the Bean Growers Association, the board, the dry bean checkoff, yeah. The checkoff. But that's really helpful. I mean, I think you move the needle forward before it was even a problem. That's always the goal.
We're over time, but I'm having fun. Are there any more questions? Yeah.
You would, as a committee or whatever, envision any shortages of herbicides? We're hearing it all in the marketplace with supply issues and whatnot. What do you guys think?
Short answer, yes, but it's going to be product dependent. So this is kind of an evolving situation. I saw that now there might be some railroad people going on strike in a week or two, so that may move the needle kind of back towards shortages. But really the two herbicides I've heard most about would be glyphosate, so Roundup and all the generics, and then glufosinate, Liberty, and those generics. I did see some, they ran out as soon as that question was asked. So some of the chemical reps kind of ran away from that one. But those are the two, and that's really because of high demand, not just in the U.S. and globally, but also a lot of the production of those two takes place overseas. And so it's kind of one of these, you know, where they coiled up the hose and supply chain issues. And so we can get it unbound and get some ships moving. We may still, by the time we're applying those products, be pretty good. So it's not as doom and gloom as we were hearing maybe in the fall. And it's really just those two key products. The other products, I'm not really hearing too much shortages. Price increase, yes, across the board. But those are the two of most concern. Herbicides, I don't know about other crop protection.
I have no idea.
I'm in herding for insecticides.
We could go in the hallway and grab those folks that just ran on.
All right. Well, thank you.